በእስርና በወከባ የሚንገላቱትን የኢትዮጵያ ጋዜጠኞችን ለመርዳት በመምጣታችሁ በአዘጋጆቹ ስም ከልብ አመሰግናችኋለሁ። አዘጋጆቹ ዓላማ እንጂ መጠሪያ ስም እንኳን ለራሳቸው ያልሰጡ ላለፉት 9 ዓመታት የኢትዮጵያን ጉዳይ የሚያሳስባቸው ኢትዮጵያን ስብስብ ሆነው ስራ ብቻ ሲሰሩ ውጤት ሲያስመዘግቡ በመሃላቸው አብዛኞቻችሁ እንደምታውቁት ፍቅር፣ መከባበር እና የመሳሰሉትን የስራ ባህል አጎልብተው የመምህራን ማህበርን፣ የኢሰመጉን እንዲሁም የጋዜጠኞችን ማህበር ልዩ ልዩ የፖለቲካ ድርጅቶችን ሲረዱ በእነዚህ 9 ዓመታት ከ150 ሺህ ብር በላይ ሰብስበው መርዳት ችለዋል። አሁንም ቅንጅትና ህብረት በለንደን በደንብ መንቀሳቀስ ሲጀምሩ እንደ ሶስተኛ የሲቪክ አካልና ኃይል ሆነው ስራቸውን ቀጥለዋል። የጎደለ ቦታ እየፈለጉ ይሞላሉ። በዛሬው ዕለት በእስር በእንግልት ላይ ለሚንከራተቱት ከ40 በላይ የሆኑ ጋዜጠኞች ቤተሰቦቻቸውንና ጥገኞቻቸውን ለመርዳት እነሆ ሰብስበውናል። Now I'm going to speak in English. Our first speaker is Dr. Martin Hill of Amnesty International. I don't think there is any Ethiopian that is unaware of this name. Dr. Martin Hill has been one of the towering support of democracy and respect for human rights in Ethiopia. Due to his constant and consistent campaign against the abuse of human rights in Ethiopia, he is persona non grata by the dictatorial regime of Ethiopia. We are privileged to have him today to speak on the human rights violation in general and the plight of journalists in particular in Ethiopia. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Martin Hill.
Thank you to the Ethiopian community in Britain for inviting me here again, and it's a pleasure to be back, a place I know, and I've talked to you before here and met many of you individually as well. I'd like to take the opportunity to say something about the imprisonment of the journalists in Ethiopia at this present time, and we'll just start by saying just a little bit about Amnesty International, and then about the situation of the media and press freedom in Ethiopia, and then about the trial of the CUD leaders, journalists and human rights defenders. And then I'll be very willing to answer your questions and maybe ask you a few questions as well. Well, Amnesty, I think you know, is a non-political independent human rights organization working on human rights globally since 1961. And it has sections and structures in many countries, but not, unfortunately, in Ethiopia. We work on all human rights in all countries in the world. That is civil political rights, prisoners of conscience, people who are imprisoned for their peaceful opinions, and that is what had been the core of Amnesty originally, against torture, death penalty, arbitrary political imprisonment, and so on. But now we have expanded our work to include all other rights, including violence against women, which is one of our biggest international campaigns at the moment, and in future on some issues of poverty and economic and social rights. This is a new field for us, and it would be interesting to see how this works in a country such as Ethiopia, one of the most underdeveloped countries in the world. I work for Amnesty, as you probably remember, as the researcher on the Horn of Africa. That means Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, and Somaliland. Now, the situation of the media in Ethiopia, you're probably fairly familiar with that yourselves. And maybe some of you are journalists, or some of you have been in Ethiopia reading the private media. and seeing what has been happening to journalists. In 1998, we published a report on Ethiopia, Journalists in Prison, Press Freedom Under Attack. And this is on our website. And looking at it again, 8 years later, 1998, yes, unfortunately, so much of it is still true and still very relevant. At that time, we said some 200 journalists of the private media had been arrested, and at that time there were about 20 or 30 in prison. Any private journalist has been in prison many times. I think when you hear from Ato Kifle, by the time he received an award from Amnesty International here for media freedom, he had been in prison 7 or 8 times himself. Now the imprisonment of journalists continued from 1998 up to now. And even just the last 2-3 months, there have been new cases of journalists being put on trial under the old press law. So this all went back to the press law of 1992, which you might remember being called a proclamation to provide for the freedom of the press. That was the call of the new government to respect press freedom, which hadn't existed before, and the law was to regulate that. Unfortunately, it regulated it in the wrong direction. It did allow a lot of newspapers. In fact, the Minister for Information at one time, Negaso Gedato, had told us 200 publications are allowed in Ethiopia. And it's true, they were. Not so many now, but there had been a massive explosion of press freedom in a way, which was to do with the movement for democracy under the post-Derg government. But the press law restricted this, put in clauses which did not match with international standards of free press, free journalism, so that journalists continued to be imprisoned in summary trials with no real opportunity to defend themselves, and large numbers were there as prisoners of conscience. The Ethiopian Free Press Journalists Association developed, despite this really repressive situation, to defend journalists and to make the link between the journalists in Ethiopia of the private media and the international media associations, such as Article 19, Committee to Protect Journalists, International Federation of Journalists, International Press Institute, Reporters Without Borders, and everybody else. The first CFJA president, Kifale Mamo, had to flee the country. Now, Kifle is charged with treason, but fortunately, he happened to be invited by Amnesty International to a conference in Entebbe and was out of the country when the arrests started. I was with him there in Entebbe. So it's really great for me to know that Kifle is going to be with you by cyberspace, by what have you got? A TV link up or something?
Somebody's mobile. Please switch off your mobiles, please.
In a
Sorry
minute,
about that.
because Kifle is now with Amnesty International in Uganda, pending whatever happens to him next. That in a way is the background. Journalists who criticize the government in any respect were being harassed, arrested, thrown into prison, and fined large amounts of money. This didn't stop them, although quite a few newspapers folded until the number was down from some dozens to at least, 10, 20, I'm not sure. in the last year or so. Then, because of all the criticisms, the government planned a new law, a new press law, which was going to deal with the criticisms. Well, it didn't, and a lot of the organisations, Article 19, you know, here in London, was in holding workshops in Ethiopia for journalists of the government as well as the private press, and trying to find some areas of common ground in terms of principles of freedom of the press, which the government would accept, and which would help raise the standards of journalism in the country as well, both the government press and the private press. But the new press law was judged by these free international media organisations as still as repressive, so it was not going to solve the problem. And the government has not yet put it in, but there were some changes to the new penal code which unfortunately strengthened some principles there which are not good for journalists. But that is on hold. Anyway, the new situation now, of course, is the elections. I'm not going to say a lot about the elections, and you know it all. The May 15 elections were held, and this was going to be a new era of multi-party democracy, real elections, different from the previous two, where the opposition was participating, holding rallies, mobilising, having offices all around the country. Different opposition parties had formed or reformed, and the people of Ethiopia would have a vote in their future and the way the country was going. This is what the international community was pressing, and the government seemed to be going along with it. In the end, they allowed international observers, and in the end, well, virtually on the eve of the election, they allowed local observers from the Organization for Social Justice in Ethiopia, OSJE. And even in the end, the Supreme Court allowed that to go ahead. However, things went differently, and the opposition organised peaceful protests claiming there had been election fraud. The protests, as you know, were suppressed violently by the army, with at least 36 people shot dead, hundreds wounded, and thousands arrested. And after that, crisis kind of wound down slightly with the release of a lot of the detainees over the next few weeks. The November protests organised by the CUD led to a further situation of starting off as peaceful protests turning violent, and with the police shooting dead, this time over 40, perhaps more. And that precipitated the crisis in which the top opposition party leaders were arrested, some of them before demonstrations, and journalists from the private press. I think there are 12 on the court list, human rights defenders, and members of other organisations such as the Ethiopian Teachers Association. So with these people in prison, 131 was the number of the people to be charged, to the people and organisations, I should say, because the political parties were charged, and the publishing houses, 6 publishing houses were charged as well. It's really quite unclear how, as corporate bodies, they're going to defend themselves. Known very publicly, very prominently, 10 members of parliament, for example, and some members elected to the Addis Ababa City Council and three civil society activists who were not in politics. They were not attached to any political party. And they were the policy director of Action Aid, an international development agency based in South Africa with an office here in London. This was Daniel Bekele, the Action Aid policy director, and the Netzanet Demissi from OSJE, the Organization for Social Justice, and both of them had worked on the global campaign against poverty, where in Ethiopia, like in many other countries of the world, citizens, civil society activists were mobilizing, trying to demonstrate, to press their governments to make real a commitment to eradicating poverty. People did that in a big way here in Britain, demonstrating and collecting signatures and campaigning very, very strongly on the British government. Their demand was to increase the percentage of aid to the countries most afflicted by poverty in the world. And this, of course, involved the Commission for Africa, Tony Blair, plus Meles Zenawi, Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. So these two anti-poverty activists who had not been engaged in election politics, but had commented on the elections, as anybody could, because they were both lawyers, British trained actually, and another civil society activist who again had not been involved in election politics, Kasahun Kebede from the Ethiopian Teachers Association, were thrown in with the other defendants. They have been trying through their lawyers to separate their cases, these three civil society activists, but this has been refused by the judge in the Supreme Court. So they are lumped together with the CUD and with the journalists, who in fact were also pretty much staying out of actual politics and performing their professional duties as journalists, as far as we know. So this trial, which will open on the 2nd of May with the prosecution case, arises out of the election protests of November. And the charges, as you know, are treason, outrages against the Constitution, inciting armed rebellion, and genocide. Ethiopia has a very defective law on genocide. Genocide in Ethiopian law is different from international law. International law on genocide is about trying to destroy a population or a part of a population or an ethnic group. In Ethiopia, there is a clause, I don't know how it got there, which refers to political groups, which nobody else in the world recognizes as falling under a genocide. But that is, and even so, it's not about killing or eliminating or destroying, but even lesser things like causing harm. An extremely vague law and definition. And Amnesty International has said that it's totally absurd to charge people like Dr. Jacob Haile Mariam, a UN genocide prosecutor in Rwanda, with genocide under this law which has nothing to do with international law. So we have called for that charge at least to be withdrawn. Even for the Derg, one would want them to be charged with massive human rights violations and crimes against humanity, but whether they were trying to eliminate an ethnic group, that probably could not be sustained. These charges carry possible death penalties. No one is thinking that that is on the horizon at all, but that is what the law says. The penalties are life imprisonment or death. So the offences for which the CUD, an open opposition party, not a liberation front, it has no army like the OLF, ONLF and other possible armed groups in Ethiopia. The CUD is a political party and they are facing charges as if they were an armed group. They have always maintained, and I think the international community has accepted that they are a non-violent political party who have never advocated, used or for violence from their supporters. And this is a position the CUD maintain while they're in prison, their leadership, and anyone else. So the prosecution is alleging crimes of violence. Amnesty International has called them prisoners of conscience, the members of parliament elect, the journalists and the human rights defenders, and possibly the others. We don't exactly know much about them individually, but probably all the other lesser defendants are regional CUD officials for All Ethiopia Unity Party or Rainbow. We're collecting information about all the individuals and building up our work on that. The trial, will it be fair? Well, there's a history of unfair political trials in Ethiopia, going back to Professor Asrat, going back to Dr. Taye Wolde-Semayat, looking at the Mecha Tulema Association, and quite a number of others. The European Union has designated a trial observer who will be observing the trial and reporting on anything which is unfair. Of course, not day by day, but to report at the end of it. But that will be a very important pressure on the judges to give recognition to international standards. The Prime Minister has said they will get a fair trial, and that has to be on record and has to be the baseline for what everybody else is looking for. So we at Amnesty International, well, we won't be observing all the trial, but we'll be especially monitoring how fair it is in terms of access to lawyers, in terms of the independence of the judges, in terms of respect for legal procedure, for court procedures. And of course we oppose the use of the death penalty completely. Other organisation, the Ethiopian Human Rights Council, has also campaigned for the abolition of the death penalty in Ethiopia. And the death penalty has not been used, with one exception, since 1991, but it is certainly death sentences are certainly being passed by courts. The other situation which concerns Amnesty International is that human rights defenders are also on trial. Human rights defenders are people who defend human rights impartially, independently, and not for any political motivation. People who look to the international standards, the standards of the African human rights treaties and conventions, and are working, campaigning for human rights for everyone, for all human rights. They are part of the international human rights defenders networks, and we have a network working with us and with others in the Horn of Africa and East Africa, which was actually formed at the meeting where Kifle was present in Uganda. It's called Network East Africa and the Horn Human Rights Defenders Network, to which Ethiopian Human Rights Council belongs, and Ethiopian Women Lawyers Association. there's a UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, which makes it quite clear that it's a legitimate function of human rights defenders to criticize violations of human rights. That it's a duty on the government to protect human rights defenders, to protect their own critics for the sake of the human rights they have agreed through their constitutions to protect and to be accountable for. So the human rights defenders in this case are, of course, the leading human rights defender in Ethiopia, Professor Mesfin Waldemariam, who you know, who has spoken many times before in London at the meetings of the Ethiopian Human Rights Council Solidarity Group. I hope that gets going again. I don't know if any of you belong to that. He founded the ERCO after the overthrow of the Derg. He was a kind of human rights defender before, when there was no chance of having an organization in Ethiopia for human rights. And he's been very solid on the principles of human rights, working with international organizations, criticizing them, criticizing his government, criticizing the donors, and trying to build up links between human rights, peace, democracy, and all the freedoms which Ethiopians should expect as well as anybody else in the world. So he is amongst those charged, and he has never advocated violence. He's advocated non-violent protest, yes, but that's not what the trial is about. In fact, it's what happened, that the charges are not about non-violent protest. And the other human rights defenders are the two anti-poverty activists I've mentioned, Daniel Bekele and Netsanet Demesi, and the Ethiopian Teachers Association, a representative from Addis Ababa, that is Kasabun Kebede, who was working for the ETA, which I now am told was shut down a day or two ago, sadly. And we will be mobilizing human rights defenders throughout the world for their cases especially. Well, as I said, that's the work of Amnesty International is on record on these cases. If you watch our website, we don't put out news releases every day. We're not like the Ethiopian Review. But we do a lot of work behind the scenes, lobbying, campaigning, and preparing much more to come. The journalists are definitely in our minds and concerns. The journalist associations of the world are already very active on their cases. This Committee to Protect Journalists from New York was in Ethiopia, was it 2 weeks ago? And they met the Prime Minister, they visited the journalists in prison. They saw their conditions. They arranged, they pressed for Eskinder Nega to meet his partner for the first time in prison, because she is detained in a different place, Sirkalem, Hasil. And they got permission for the journalists to have books. You would think that this would not be a necessary thing to press, because normally political prisoners have books. They may not have private visits or private correspondence allowed, but they have books. And so the journalists, I think, were allowed books, and we'll see if that applies to all the prisoners of conscience there. I think I'll finish now. I look forward to seeing Kifle on television and talking about that, and I'd be very ready to receive you.